The crystal was already at her lips when he said the name, and for one breath she did not lower the glass, because lowering it would mean she had heard him, and she had decided, in the span between the second syllable and that she had not yet decided whether to hear him at all. The candles along the long table did their dutiful work, throwing soft gold across the silver and the polished wood, across the pearled shoulders of 24 guests who had been invited expressly to witness the 8th year of a marriage and who were now witnessing something else entirely. The Duke stood at the head of the table, with his glass raised, his cuffs immaculate, his color very high, and his eyes, she noted with a kind of distant scholarly interest, fixed not on her but on a point somewhere above the centerpiece, as if the chrysanthemums there might absorb the consequences of what he had just said. He had said a woman's name. He had said it with affection. He had said it in a toast. The room had performed the small involuntary shudder a room performs when it has been struck and is not yet sure where the bruise will rise. Lady Moraine Ashcombe, Duchess of Wendover, held her glass where it was, exactly at the level of her mouth, and looked at her husband with the polite, attentive interest of a guest at a lecture whose subject she did not entirely follow. She had 8 seconds. She had counted them as a girl, when her governess had taught her that a noblewoman has exactly 8 seconds in any catastrophe to decide what shape her face will take for the rest of her life. 1, 2, 3. The footman at the sideboard, a boy of perhaps 17 with a fresh shave and an unfortunate ear, had stopped pouring mid-glass and was watching the wine climb a hair past the engraved line without daring to tilt the decanter. 4. 5. The Dowager Lady Halverton, 2 seats down, had set her fork upon her plate without making any sound at all, a feat of such social athleticism that under any other circumstance Moraine would have admired it openly. 6. 7. At the foot of the table, her own father, who had not approved of this match and had not been allowed to say so for 8 years, drew in a breath so careful it might have been mistaken for indifference. 8. She lowered the glass a 1/4 of an inch. She did not lower it further. She smiled. It was not a wide smile. It was the small, contained, perfectly proportioned smile of a woman who has been complimented on her gloves, and it cost her, in that instant, more than any of the jewels at her throat. The Duke, having delivered the name, seemed to discover only now that he had delivered it, and his face, which had been pink with wine and sentiment, attempted 3 expressions in quick succession before settling on a kind of bewildered grandeur, as though he had meant all along to be exactly this surprised by himself. He lifted his glass a little higher. He said the rest of his toast. He said, in the warm, confident baritone that had once, 8 years ago, in a long gallery hung with portraits of his ancestors, persuaded her that he was a kind man, that he wished to drink, on this auspicious evening, to constancy. To constancy, he said. To the women who had stood by him. The plural was very small. The plural was the size of a pin. The plural went into the room and found her where she sat and stitched itself, neatly, through the soft place under her ribs. Moraine did not look down. She had been schooled out of looking down at the age of 9, when her mother had explained, while braiding her hair, that a woman who looks at her own lap has surrendered the room. Her mother had been dead 7 years. She thought of her mother now with a sudden, surprising clarity. The cool pressure of those fingers against her scalp, the smell of orange water, the patient, unhurried voice. A woman who looks at her own lap. She did not look at her lap. She looked, instead, at the candle nearest to her, at the small, clear pool of wax that had gathered around its base, at the way the light bent itself around the rim of her glass and threw a thin gold thread across the white cloth. She thought, with the same scholarly distance, that the thread of light was very pretty, and that she had, in fact, been looking at threads of light her entire married life. There had always been one. There had always been a small glinting filament along the edge of every gathering, every supper, every long, sleepless winter morning, and she had attended to it the way other women attended to embroidery, because looking at the thread had been easier than looking at the fabric it was meant to be part of. She set her free hand against the stem of the glass. She felt the cool weight of it, the engraved W of his house pressing faintly into the pad of her thumb. She heard, Somewhere very far away, a small bright sound that might have been a fork touching porcelain, and might have been her own composure, struck once, ringing. The Duke was still speaking. He was thanking the assembled company for honoring this milestone. He was, she realized with a peculiar tenderness, entirely unaware that he had just removed the floor from beneath her. He believed he had been generous. He believed he had been gallant. He believed, perhaps most touchingly, that she had not heard the name, because he had not in 8 years ever seen her hear anything she did not wish to. She lifted her glass again. She lifted it slowly. She lifted it the precise distance required to be seen, lifting it by every person in the room. And she turned, not to him, but to the table at large, to the candles, to the chrysanthemums, to the dowager's frozen fork, to the footman with his hovering decanter, to her father's careful breath, and she said, in a voice that surprised her by being entirely her own, that she wished to add a small word to his lordship's toast, if the company would indulge her. The company indulged her. The company would have indulged her if she had asked to set fire to the curtains. She smiled again, that same contained smile, and she said that she drank this evening to constancy as well. She drank to her husband's constancy. She drank to the constancy of the lady whose name had so kindly been included. She drank, she said, with a small inclination of the head, to them. To them, she said. The word fell into the silence and made very little sound. She tipped the glass at her lips. She tasted nothing. She set the glass down, not hard, not loudly, but with a precision that had the unmistakable weight of a final stitch. She rose. She rose without haste. She placed her napkin upon the table beside her plate, folded once, not twice, and she stepped back from her chair, and the chair was drawn out for her by the footman with the fresh shave, whose hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly, and to whom? In passing, she gave the smallest nod of thanks, because her mother had also taught her that one does not, even in extremity, forget the people who have done their work. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at her father. She walked the length of the long room with her glass empty in her hand, and her head at exactly the angle her governess had drilled into her at the age of 11, and at the great double doors she paused, only for a heartbeat, and then she went through them, and the doors closed behind her. And on the far side of those doors, the dining room she had presided over for 8 years became, very simply, a room she had left. The corridor was cooler than the dining room and smelled of beeswax and the faint green note of the cut yew the gardeners had brought in that morning to dress the hall. She walked without hurrying. She had learned, long ago, that hurry was a kind of confession. Her slippers made almost no sound upon the marble, and the long mirror at the turn of the passage gave her, as she passed it, a quick glimpse of a tall woman in dove-gray silk with a band of small diamonds at her throat and a face so composed it might have been a portrait, and she did not, for once, recognize the woman, and she did not stop to make the introduction. At the foot of the great staircase, she met Mrs. Pell, the housekeeper, who had served the house since before the Duke had inherited it, and who carried, perpetually, a small ring of keys at her waist that chimed very softly when she walked. Mrs. Pell did not ask. Mrs. Pell looked once at her face and then once at the empty glass in her hand and said only, "My lady," and inclined her head, and Moraine, hearing her own voice come out perfectly steady, said that she would like a fire in the blue sitting room, and a pot of strong tea and her writing case, and Mrs. Pell said, "My lady," again, in a different register, the register of a woman who has been waiting 8 years to be useful in precisely this way, and went. Moraine climbed the stairs. She climbed them slowly, because she did not yet trust her knees and because she did not wish to give the stairs the satisfaction of carrying her any faster than she chose. At the landing, she paused beneath the portrait of the third Duke, who had been, according to family legend, a man of such grim economy that he had been buried in a coat, turned for the 3rd time, and she looked up at his painted face for a long moment and thought, with a small private flicker of something almost like humor, that he would have understood her this evening better than any of the living men downstairs. She went on. The blue sitting room had been hers since the 2nd year of her marriage, when she had asked very mildly for a room of her own that did not adjoin his, and he had granted it with the same mild surprise with which he granted all her small requests, as though it had not occurred to him that she might want anything at all. The walls were the soft blue of a robin's egg, and the curtains were heavier than fashion required, and there was a low chair near the hearth that she had reupholstered herself, in secret, one winter when she had been very lonely, and had wished to do something with her hands that no one would praise her for. The fire was being laid as she entered. The maid, a sturdy girl from the village called Annis, did not look up from the grate, but her shoulders, Moren saw, had a particular stiffness, the stiffness of someone who has already heard, by the inscrutable telegraphy of great houses, what had happened at the table. News travels, in such places, faster than the people who carry it. By the time Mrs. Pell returned with the tea, the entire household, from the boot boy to the butler, would know that the Duchess had been toasted past, and would have begun, quietly, in their own quarters, to choose sides. Moren sat in the low chair. She did not sit gracefully. She sat the way a woman sits when she has at last reached a chair she can trust. She set the empty glass upon the small table at her elbow. She looked at it. She looked at the engraved W on its bowl, his initial, his house, his mark upon a thing meant to touch her mouth, and she thought, with a clarity that astonished her, that she had been drinking from his initial for 8 years. The thought was not bitter. It was the thought of a woman who has just noticed, in good light, the pattern on a wallpaper she has lived with so long she had ceased to see it. Annis finished with the fire and rose and curtsied and went, and the door closed, and Moren was alone with the small, decent crackle of new flame and the distant, almost imperceptible vibration of the dining room 3 floors below, where, she presumed, her husband was even now attempting with that bewildered grandeur to recover the evening. She did not pity him. She did not yet hate him. She was, she realized, between feelings, in that thin, clear country a person passes through once or twice in a life, where the old country has been left and the new country has not yet declared its borders. She put her hand flat upon her own knee and felt, through the silk, the small, steady pressure of her own bone, and she was grateful, in a sudden, uncomplicated way, for the fact of her own body, which had carried her, without complaint, the length of the long dining room and up the great staircase and into this chair. Mrs. Pell came with the tea. She came alone, which was itself a message, and she set the tray down with the particular soundlessness of a woman who has spent 40 years setting trays down in rooms where someone was weeping or refusing to weep. She poured. She did not speak. She added the milk in the proportion Moren preferred, and she handed the cup across, and only then, as Moren took it, did Mrs. Pell say, very quietly, that the writing case was on the desk and that the lamp had been trimmed and that, if her ladyship required anything further, she had only to ring. Moren looked at her. She looked at the lined, patient face that had been the first face she had seen in this house 8 years ago. When she had arrived as a bride of 19 with her trunks and her mother's pearls and her terror neatly tucked beneath her smile, she said, Mrs. Pell, and her voice did the small, unforgivable thing of catching, just once, on the second syllable, and Mrs. Pell, without altering her expression, reached out and laid her dry, warm, key-scented hand briefly upon Moren's wrist, and said, My lady, I have known since the spring, and I am sorry it was tonight. The fire popped. Moren held the teacup very still, so Mrs. Pell had known. Mrs. Pell, who knew everything, had known. The spring. That made it, 7 months? 7 months in which her husband had been constant, in his particular sense of the word, to someone whose name she now knew because he had said it over the chrysanthemums. She thought of the spring. She thought of the long, damp March when she had been ill with a low fever, and he had been so very attentive, so unusually present, sitting by her bed in the evenings with a book he did not read. She had been touched at the time. She had thought then that perhaps after 7 years they were finding, at last, a quieter affection. She set the teacup down. She did not, she discovered, wish to weep. She wished instead to write. She crossed to the desk. The writing case was open, the inkwell uncapped, the pen laid neatly upon the blotter. Mrs. Pell, she thought again with that distant scholarly admiration, missed nothing. She sat. She drew a sheet of her own paper toward her. the cream paper with the small gray monogram at the head, the M and the A entwined, her own initials, the initials of the girl she had been before there had been a W to drink from. She dipped the pen. She did not, at first, know to whom she was writing. She knew only that words were rising in her with a pressure she had not felt in years, and that if she did not let them out onto paper, they would find some less dignified exit. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She wrote the hour beneath the date. She thought, with the same flicker of private humor that had visited her on the landing, that she was, by instinct, keeping a record. As though some future court might require her to prove the precise moment at which her marriage had been concluded by toast. She set the pen down. She got up. She walked once around the room. She stopped at the window and parted the curtain, a finger's width, and looked out at the dark park, at the line of bare elms, at the faint, pale stripe of the drive, at the cold, indifferent moon, which, she noted, was 3 days past full and declining, and she said aloud, to the room or to the moon or to herself, very softly, "Well, only that. Well." The words steadied her. She returned to the desk. She picked up the pen. She wrote, after all, to her father. She wrote 3 lines. She wrote that he was not to make a scene, that she required, by morning, the use of his small house in town, the one on Marjorie Street that had belonged to her grandmother and that she had been given the keys to on her 18th birthday and had not, in 8 years, used, and that she would explain everything when she saw him, but that she was, in essentials, entirely well. She signed it with her own name. She did not write Wendover. She wrote Maren Ashcombe, which had been her name before she had been given another, and which was, she discovered with a small surprise, still her name underneath. She sealed the letter. She rang the bell. A different footman came, an older man with graying side whiskers called Hibbert, who had been with her father's house before he had come with her to this one, and who, when he saw her face, did not require to be told that the letter was urgent. She gave him the letter. She told him to take it himself, on horseback, and to wait for an answer. He bowed. He said, "My lady." He went. The clock on the mantel chimed the half-hour with a small, thin, silver sound, and Maren sat back in her chair and put her hands flat upon the desk and looked at them, at the long fingers, at the wedding ring, at the small thread of light the lamp threw along the gold. She turned the ring on her finger. She did not yet remove it. There was, she thought, a difference between leaving a room and leaving a marriage, and she had this evening done the first, and she would, in time, do the second. But the second was a longer walk and required better shoes. The door opened without a knock. She did not need to look up to know who it was. She had been waiting, in some part of herself, since the moment she had set down the empty glass downstairs, for him to find his way to this room. He came in heavily. He shut the door behind him with the particular care of a man who has been drinking and is concentrating very hard upon not appearing to have been drinking. He stood for a long moment in the middle of the carpet. She did not rise. She did not turn. She said, without looking at him, that he was, she believed, expected back at his guests. He said her name. He said it the way he had used to say it, in the first year, when he had still been trying to learn the shape of her, and the sound of it in his mouth was so unexpectedly familiar that she had, for one treacherous instant, to close her eyes. She opened them. She turned her chair, not entirely, only enough to look at him sideways. The way one looks at a painting one is deciding whether to keep. He had the high color still. His cravat was a little loosened. His eyes, she saw, were not the eyes of a man who had triumphed at his own table. They were the eyes of a man who had heard, only after the door had closed behind her, the sound of what he had said. He began to speak. He began 3 different sentences. He said, "Maren, I." He said, "You must understand." He said, "It was the wine. It was the warmth of the company. It was a slip, a foolish slip. A husband may be permitted, on such an evening." She watched him work through the available defenses. She watched him discover, one by one, that none of them would carry his weight. She did not help him. She had spent 8 years helping him through sentences, smoothing his small public stumbles, taking the wine glass gently from his hand at the right moment, finishing his thought aloud with such grace that he came to believe it had been his own. and she found, this evening, that she had laid down the work, and that the work, set down, looked from a small distance, very like servitude. He came closer. He stopped at the edge of the desk. He looked at the letter she had not yet had time to put away, at the cream paper with her own initials at the head, at the wax still soft on the seal, and his face did a small private thing she had seen perhaps 3 times in 8 years, a thing that was, she thought, the closest he came in his life to fear. He said, "Who have you written to?" She said, "My father." He said, "Maren," she said, "I have asked him for the use of grandmother's house. I shall go in the morning. I shall take Annis, and Mrs. Pell will know what is to be sent on. I shall not, this evening, cause you any further embarrassment in front of your guests. You may tell them whatever you wish. You may tell them I have a headache. You may tell them I have been called away to a sick aunt. You may tell them, if you prefer, the truth. I find I have no preference." The pen, in her hand, was perfectly steady. She had not known she was still holding it. She set it down. He stared at her. He said, "You are overreacting." She did not answer. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. He had never in 8 years been able to fill a silence she had decided to keep, and tonight, she thought, was no different, except that tonight she was the one who had decided. He passed his hand across his face. He sat, uninvited, on the small chair by the desk, which was a chair her mother had given her, and which creaked, very faintly, under him. He said, after a while, in a voice quite unlike the voice that had toasted the chrysanthemums, that he had not meant to say the name. She believed him. That was the worst of it. She believed him entirely. He had not meant to say the name. He had meant only, in his own muddled way, to be magnanimous, to be expansive, to be the kind of man whose affections were large enough to encompass more than one woman, and whose wife was generous enough to understand. He had meant, in his own muddled way, to be happy aloud, and he had been, she realized, happy. That was the thing she had not, until this evening, allowed herself to know. He had been, for some months now, happy, in a way he had not been with her for a very long time, and the happiness had pressed upward through the wine, and had spoken a name, and the name had been the wrong one for the room, and the room had been hers. She said very quietly, "I know you did not mean to say it." He looked up. There was, briefly, hope in his face. She said, "That is why I am going." She did not sleep that night. She had not expected to. After he had gone, after the door had closed behind him with the same careful soundlessness with which he had opened it, after she had sat for a long while, watching the fire reduce itself to the patient red architecture it kept beneath its flames, she rose and went, in her stocking feet, through the small connecting passage to her dressing room, and she stood for some time before the long glass and looked at herself in the dove-gray silk, and she undid, finger by finger, the clasp of the diamond band at her throat, and she laid it in its velvet case, and she closed the case, and she set the case upon the dressing table, and she did not, then or later, put it on again. Annis came at the sound of the case closing. Annis had been waiting in the passage. Maren realized, perhaps the entire hour, and she did not scold her for it, because there was a kind of love in that waiting that no scolding ought to disturb. They undressed her together in silence. Annis did not speak until the silk was folded and the stays were loosened and the long plain nightdress was over her head, and then Annis said, "My lady, am I to pack?" Maren said, "Yes." Annis said, "Everything." Maren said, "The small trunk only, the blue dress, the brown, the gray wool, my books, my mother's pearls, the writing case, the little clock by the bed, nothing else." Annis said, "My lady," and curtsied, and went. And Maren heard her, presently, opening the cedar drawers in the next room with the careful efficiency of a girl who had been preparing, in her own mind, for this departure for longer than she had admitted. Maren sat upon the edge of the bed. The bed was very wide and very cold, as it had been for some years now, and she did not lie down upon it. She sat on the edge of it with her hands folded in her lap, and she let her mind go, at last, to the name. She let herself say it, in her own head, once. She did not say it aloud. She had decided, walking up the great staircase, that she would not say the name aloud, ever, because to say it aloud would be to give it a place in her mouth, and she had decided that her mouth, henceforth, was her own. But she let herself think it. She thought it with a curious gentleness. She thought of the woman who bore the name, whom she had met perhaps twice, at long suppers, a slender, dark-haired woman with quick eyes and a low laugh and a habit of resting her hand, very briefly, upon the Duke's sleeve when she made a point, a gesture Miren had noted at the time with the same scholarly distance with which she had noted the thread of light along her glass, and had set aside because a wife who notes such gestures and acts upon them becomes, in the world's accounting, the thing she did not wish to be. She thought of that woman now with outrage. She thought, in fact, with something nearer to pity, because she understood, suddenly, with the cold, clean clarity of the hour, that the woman with the low laugh had also been waiting 8 years for someone to say her name in a toast, and that the Duke had given her that this evening, and would not, in the years that followed, ever be able to give her more. He could not be constant in the singular. He had said the word himself, to constancy. To the women, the plural was the size of a pin, and the pin was, in the end, in him. Toward morning, the fire had gone almost out. The room was very cold. Miren rose, at last, and went to the window and parted the curtain again, and saw that the dark park had given itself over to that hour before dawn, when the world is at its most honest, when colors have not yet returned but shapes have, and the bare elms stood along the drive like a row of patient witnesses, and the moon had gone, and the sky was the thin gray of unpolished pewter, and somewhere in the home wood a single early bird tried out a phrase and stopped, embarrassed by the silence, and tried again. She watched until the bird succeeded. She watched until the phrase, on its third attempt, held. Then she let the curtain fall and turned back to the room and rang very softly for tea. By 8 o'clock, the household had organized itself around her departure, with the unspoken precision of a regiment that has been drilled for an emergency it had hoped would not come. Mrs. Pell had laid out a plain traveling dress, the dark gray wool with the high collar, because Miren had said gray wool, and Mrs. Pell did not require to be told which. The small trunk stood at the foot of the bed, strapped. The writing case lay on top of it, locked, the key already on the chain at her waist beside the small enamel watch her mother had given her. Annis had eaten nothing, Miren saw, and she sent her down to the kitchen with an instruction so mild it could not be refused, that she was to have bread and butter and a cup of milk and to be told, by Mrs. Pell, that her ladyship insisted. Hibbert had returned in the small hours with her father's reply, 3 lines in her father's spare, slanting hand. The house was hers, the keys were within. He would not come down himself, because she had asked him not to make a scene, and a father's arriving in person at dawn was, he wrote with a small dry inflection that was as close as he came to humor, a scene by definition. He would call upon her in town when she was settled. He was, as ever, hers. She folded the letter and put it in the writing case. She drank her tea. She ate, at Mrs. Pell's insistence, a single slice of toast, which tasted of nothing, and she was grateful for the nothing because nothing was easier, at that hour, than something. At 8:30 she went down. She went down by the back stairs, not by the great staircase, because the great staircase descended into the hall where the previous evening's guests, those who had stayed the night, might already be drifting toward the breakfast room, and she had no wish to be the subject of any further toast, however well-intentioned. The back stairs were narrow and uncarpeted, and smelled faintly of soap, and they led her out into the small flagged passage by the still room, where Mrs. Pell was waiting with her cloak. Mrs. Pell put the cloak about her shoulders. Mrs. Pell fastened the clasp at her throat. Mrs. Pell did not, this time, say my lady. Mrs. Pell said, Miss Miren, you take care of yourself now, in the tone of a woman who had nursed her through a fever in March and was nursing her, again, through a different kind of fever this morning, and Miren, hearing the old name, the name she had been called as a girl in this house when she had first arrived, almost broke, and did not, because the breaking was, she had decided, to be kept for the carriage. The carriage was waiting at the side door, not the front. Hibbert had seen to that. The horses steamed gently into the cold air, and the coachman, a steady older man called Pierce, who had driven her since before her marriage, touched his hat without speaking. Annis was already inside with the small trunk, her face very pale, and her hands folded with the rigid neatness of someone determined not to weep in front of the horses. Maren stepped up. She turned on the step and looked back only once at the long gray face of the house, at the row of windows along the upper floor, at the one window that was hers and that Annis, with some quiet instinct, had left its curtain drawn so that the room behind it might be, for a little while longer, a room one might still come back to. She did not see the Duke at any window. She had not expected to. He had, she knew, finally fallen asleep in the library, in the small hours, in the leather chair by the dead fire, his cravat still loose and his glass still on the table beside him, and he would wake, presently, to a house in which she was no longer present, and he would discover, slowly, over the course of the day, that the discovery was permanent. She did not pity him. She did not hate him. She wished him, distantly and without warmth, the safe arrival of his own understanding. She got into the carriage. She drew the door shut herself. Pierce clicked his tongue, and the horses leaned into the traces, and the wheels turned on the gravel with the long, crunching sigh that great houses make when they let someone go. And the drive unwound itself before her in the pale early light, between the rows of patient elms, and she did not look back again. She did not need to. The looking back had been done, in its entirety, in the 8 seconds she had counted at the table the night before, and she had nothing further to look back at. The house on Marjorie Street was smaller than she remembered, and dustier than her grandmother would have permitted, and Maren loved it instantly, with the surprised love of a person who has not been allowed, in a long time, to love anything that asked nothing of her. There were 3 rooms upstairs and 3 down, and a narrow garden behind, and a kitchen with a copper kettle and a row of blue plates upon a high shelf, and a long scrub table that bore, faintly, the ghost of an inkstain her grandmother had made one afternoon in 1822, while writing a furious letter to a bishop. The keys turned stiffly, the hinges complained. The dust rose in long, slow columns in the bars of light that came through the shutters, and Annis, who had been silent for the entire journey, took one look at the kitchen and burst into tears, not of sorrow but of professional outrage, and rolled up her sleeves at once. Maren let her. There is a kindness in letting people you love do the work they know how to do. She went upstairs alone. She went into the small front bedroom which had been her grandmother's, and which had a low bed with a faded blue cover and a window that looked down upon the street, and she opened the shutters with both hands, and the cold, pale London light came in and laid itself across the floorboards, and she stood in it for a long moment with her eyes closed. She had not, since the age of 17, stood in a room in which no one expected anything of her. She did not know what to do with the standing. She did it for a long time. By midday, Annis had a fire in the kitchen, and bread from the corner and tea from the canister her grandmother had left, which was 8 years stale, and which they drank anyway because the drinking was a ceremony, and the ceremony required tea. By the afternoon, a boy had come from her father's house with a hamper containing cold chicken and a pot of preserves, and a single hothouse pear and a note in her father's hand that said only, "Eat." By evening, Mrs. Pell had sent on, by a discreet carrier, the books from the blue sitting room and the little clock by the bed and the low chair she had reupholstered in secret, which had been, it turned out, the one piece of furniture in the Duke's house that was unambiguously hers. Maren set the chair by the small hearth in the parlor of the Marjorie Street house. She set the clock upon the mantel. She set the books upon the shelf. She sat in the chair. The clock ticked. The fire crackled. Annis, in the kitchen, sang very softly to herself, a tune from the village she came from, and Maren, listening, realized she had never heard Annis sing before, and that Annis had been, in the great gray house, a girl who did not sing. She thought, well, the word had become, in 24 hours, a kind of prayer. Well, there would be, she knew, a great many things to manage. There would be letters to write, settlements to negotiate, lawyers with grave faces and longer words. There would be a society which would, for some weeks or months, take pleasure in her name, and a society which would, in time, take pleasure in something else. There would be a man who had been her husband who would, at some point, ask to call, and to whom she would, at some point, decide whether or not to open the door. There would be a woman with a low laugh whose name she would never say aloud, and who, in her own house across the city, would be discovering this morning that the toast at the long table had not, after all, given her what she had hoped. There would be a father who would come to tea, awkwardly, on Thursday, and who would sit upon her grandmother's chair as though it might pinch him, and who would say, eventually, in his spare way, that he had always thought, and Maren would let him not finish the sentence, because she had spent 8 years not letting men finish sentences, and she had grown fond of the practice. There would be a long winter, and a spring after the winter, and the spring would surprise her, as springs do. But that was all to come. That evening there was only the chair, and the clock, and the small fire, and the singing in the kitchen, and the cold, pale London light fading at the window into the soft blue of a robin's egg, the exact blue of the room she had left, as though the city had laid out, in welcome, a small piece of what had been hers. She drew the chair closer to the fire. She put her feet upon the fender. She closed her eyes, and there, at last, in a house that asked nothing of her, in a chair she had made with her own hands, with no one watching and no toast pending and no 8 seconds to count, the thing she had been holding since the chrysanthemums broke. It broke quietly. She did not weep loudly. She wept the way a long closed window weeps when it is opened in the rain, with a small steady running that the room absorbs without comment. Annis in the kitchen went on singing. The clock went on ticking. The fire went on doing its patient work. After a while, she opened her eyes and dried her face with the back of her hand and reached for her teacup, and the tea was cold, and she drank it anyway, because cold tea, drunk by a woman in her own chair in her own house, was a different drink entirely from cold tea drunk by a duchess waiting for a husband to come up. She set the cup down. She smiled. It was a different smile than the one she had given the table the night before. It was not contained. It was not proportioned. It was small and crooked, and entirely her own, and there was in it the first faint warmth of something she had not felt in 8 years and could not, yet, quite name. She would name it later. She was in no hurry. She had, she realized, the rest of her life in which to name things, and no one to ask her to be quick about it. Word of the dinner ran through the town, as such words do, with the speed and the inaccuracy of a hare. By the end of the week, there were 3 versions in circulation, none of them quite right and all of them, in their way, generous to her. In one version, she had thrown the wine in his face. In another, she had laughed aloud, a clear, ringing laugh, and called for her carriage from the table. In the third, which was the version preferred by the Dowager Lady Halverton and which therefore became, in time, the official one, she had risen with the dignity of a queen and toasted them both back and walked out, and not been seen since. Maren, when these versions reached her in the post or by way of Annis, who had a cousin in service in 3 different houses, listened to each with grave attention and corrected none of them. A reputation, she thought, was a garment one ought to let other people tailor, within reason. It saved a great deal of fitting. The Duke, for his part, behaved, in the weeks that followed, almost exactly as she had expected him to. He wrote 3 letters in the first week, each longer than the last, each more elaborately contrite, each signed with the full weight of his name. She read them. She did not answer. He sent, after the letters, flowers, which she had Annis give to the woman next door, who was a widow with a sick child and who needed flowers more than she did. He came, at last, in person, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week, and stood upon her grandmother's step in his good coat, with his hat in his hands, and Annis, under instruction, told him that her ladyship was not at home. He came again on the Thursday. He came again on the Saturday. On the 2nd Tuesday he came, and Maren, who had been watching from the upstairs window without quite admitting to herself that she had been watching, saw that he had lost a little weight, and that his color was no longer high, and she came down, and she opened the door herself, and she let him into the parlor, and she sat him in a chair that was not her grandmother's chair and not her own, but a plain, straight-backed chair by the window, and she gave him tea, and she let him speak. He spoke for a long time. He said many things. He said that he had been a fool. He said that he had not understood, until he had walked the empty corridors of his own house, what he had had. He said that the woman whose name he had spoken at the table had, 2 days after the dinner, returned his last letter unopened, with a single line written across the seal in her quick, sharp hand, which he did not quote, and which Maren, with a small, private flicker, suspected she could write herself. He said that he had drunk too much in those first weeks and had been advised by his doctor to drink less, and had, to his own surprise, found the advice tolerable. He said that he was not asking her to come back. He was, he said, only asking that she allow him, in time, to be a man she did not despise. Maren listened. She listened with the same scholarly attention with which she had listened to him 8 years ago, in the long gallery, when he had told her he was a kind man. She found this time that she believed perhaps half of what he said, and that the half she believed was the half he had not rehearsed. She said, when he had finished, that she did not despise him. She said it gently. She said that she had, she thought, never despised him, and that this was, perhaps, the saddest part of the whole business. She said that she was not coming back. She said that he might write to her, occasionally on matters of business, and that she would answer on matters of business in kind. She said that if, in some distant year, they met at a long supper, she would incline her head, and he might incline his, and the world might make of it what the world wished. She said that she wished him, in a tone so neutral it almost shocked her. Well, he sat very still. He set his teacup down. He said after a long moment, "Thank you, Maren." And he rose, and he took up his hat. So Tama went, and she watched him from the parlor window walk away down Marjorie Street, with the careful step of a man who has been struck a blow he did not, in the end, dispute. She did not see him again for 2 years. What became of the rest of them, the cast of that long candlelit table, came to her in the way news comes to a woman who has made herself, on purpose, a little hard to find. The Dowager Lady Halverton, having installed Maren as the heroine of her preferred version, took it upon herself to call upon her once a month, always on a Friday, always with a small box of Maren's glacés, and Maren, who did not particularly like Maren's glacés, ate them and was glad of the company. The Dowager pronounced the house on Marjorie Street, on her first visit, to be entirely too small for a duchess, and on her 6th visit declared it to be the most sensible house in town, having in the interim revised her definition of duchess and found the old one wanting. The footman with the fresh shave and the unfortunate ear was given at Mrs. Pell's quiet recommendation, a place in the household of Maren's father, where he prospered, and where he eventually married, after a long and decorous courtship, the upper housemaid, who had been waiting with admirable patience for him to notice that she was waiting. Mrs. Pell remained at the great grey house because she had told Maren, when the matter was raised, that someone had to keep an eye on his lordship, and that she was, at her time of life, too set in her keys to learn new locks. But she wrote every Sunday, in her careful slanting hand, a letter that was at once a report and a comfort. And Maren kept the letters in a wooden box in the drawer of her grandmother's desk and read them on evenings when she felt the cold. The woman with the low laugh married, 2 years later, a banker in Bristol, and was, by all accounts, neither happy nor unhappy, which was, Maren suspected with the same gentleness she had felt at the bedroom window that first night, perhaps the most that life had ever intended for her. Maren's father came to tea on Thursdays, as predicted, and sat upon her grandmother's chair without being pinched by it, and learned, over the course of a winter, to finish his own sentences in her presence, which was, between them, a kind of slow, late peace. Annis, who had been the village girl who did not sing, became, in the Marjorie Street house, a young woman who sang openly and badly and constantly, and who, at the age of 23, was courted by the baker's son 3 streets over, and accepted him, and brought him to be inspected in the parlor with a fierce blush that Maren would remember, years afterward, with a tenderness she could not entirely explain. And Maren herself, who had walked out of a dining room in dove-gray silk with an empty glass in her hand, became, slowly, over the course of those same years, a woman whom people in that town began to consult, quietly, on matters they could not consult anyone else upon, a woman who answered letters carefully and kept her own counsel, a woman who was seen, sometimes, walking in the park at the cold hour just before dawn, when the bare elms stood like patient witnesses and the early bird tried out its phrase, and who was, by then, not waiting for the phrase to hold because she had become, in her own quiet way, the phrase herself. And here, friend, the fire has burned low, and the kettle has stopped its small singing, and I will tell you, before I let you go, that this story was never, in the end, about a toast. A toast is only a small bright sound a glass makes when it is struck. The story was about the 8 seconds afterward, and the long walk down the corridor, and the chair by the small hearth in the house on Marjorie Street, and the cold tea drunk by a woman in her own room. If you have ever sat at a table where the wrong name was said, gently or carelessly, by someone who ought to have known better, and counted, behind your composed face, the seconds you had been given to decide what shape your life would take from there, then you have already been in this story, and you do not need me to tell you what it cost, and you do not need me to tell you what it was worth. I will only say, because the hour is late and the fire is kind, that there is a particular dignity in lifting a glass to people who have wronged you and walking out without spilling a drop, and that the dignity is not for them. It is for the woman you are quietly becoming on the far side of the door. Before you go back out into your own night, tell me, if you will, which moment stayed with you most? The 8 seconds at the table, the housekeeper's hand upon her wrist by the fire, the bird trying its phrase against the pewter sky, or the small crooked smile in the chair she had reupholstered in secret. Tell me, too, when you sit down next by whatever fire you keep. If you would like to keep sitting with stories like this one, told slowly, by this fire, you are welcome to pull up a chair beside me. There will be another story next, and another after that, and the kettle, as you have heard, knows the way. For now, friend, let the lamp burn a little lower, and rest your hands, and sleep well, and walk gently, and remember, when the wrong name is said at your own long table, that you have 8 seconds, and that 8 seconds, used well, is time enough for a whole new life to begin.